And now I'm going to be reading from chapter 7, Words from the Past. I thought I would end tonight's reading with a reading about a reading. This takes place in a bar. Grace has announced to her friends her intentions to run for city council of the town of Celestial. There's been a reaction, as you can imagine. After discussing the pros and cons, they've gone off to dance, leaving Grace alone. Her companion's departure left Grace with a clearer view of the rest of the room. As she sat, thoughtfully nursing her beer, she noticed an attractive blonde woman alone at a corner table. She had a deck of oversized cards in her hands and was looking down at the table in front of her. At first, Grace thought she might be playing solitaire, but something about the shape and look of the cards made her doubt that. As she stared, the woman looked up straight into Grace's eyes. She smiled, then looked back down at her cards. Something about that smile convinced Grace that she had to know more. After asking an acquaintance at the next table to watch her and her friends' things, Grace walked slowly over to where the blonde woman sat. "What are you playing?" Grace asked. The woman looked up and smiled again. "I'm playing at telling the future. My future, I mean. I can't say the game is going all that well. My name is Joan, by the way." "I'm sorry," Grace said. "My name is Grace. I was wondering so much about what you were doing, I forgot my manners." "Well, that's all right," Joan replied. She looked to Grace to be just a few years older than herself. She was also just a bit heavier, though something about the way she sat led Grace to believe she was in fairly good physical shape. Her hair was pulled into a ponytail. She had on a pink sweatshirt with Clarkson Women's College emblazoned on it. Her eyes, now resting on Grace, were profoundly blue, the kind of blue in which a person could lose herself. "Telling the future?" Grace stammered out, recovering herself from those eyes. "What do you mean?" "Well, you know about the tarot, don't you?" Joan asked. "You mean those special cards?" Grace replied. She looked down at the cards for the first time since approaching Joan. "Oh yeah, I didn't see that. You've got those cards like the gypsies and them have at fairs and stuff." "That's right," Joan replied, smiling. "A friend of mine back at school gave me these. She said she thought they might help. Her idea was that the cards are more like a window into a person's mind and soul than some kind of magician's toy." "What card is that?" Grace asked, pointing to the Queen of Swords that was lying face up on the table. "I haven't seen one like that before." "That's the Queen of Swords," Joan replied, motioning for Grace to sit down. "She's part of what's called the Minor Arcana. There are 56 of those. The suites are swords, wands, cups, and pentangles. Likely you've seen just the major arcana, like the Tower here, or the Fool." Grace nodded. "Does it really work?" she asked. "Sometimes." Joan paused, looking at Grace intently. "Would you like for me to tell your fortune?" "It'd be a favor to me, actually. I'm kind of tired of looking at my own." "Sure," Grace replied. "Here then," said Joan as she gathered up her cards. "I'm going to show you the cards in order. Just clear your mind and look at each one. Then I'll let you shuffle 3 times, then cut 3 times. That way, you see, it'll be all up to you and your subconscious. After that, I'll deal out a simple pattern with 3 cards for your past, present, and future. First, though," she looked through the deck and pulled out the Queen of Swords again. "This will be you." Grace nodded, not certain about all the words she just heard. She then looked patiently as Joan turned the cards over for her one at a time, turning them upright if they were originally upside down. It seemed to Grace that each of the cards, the numbered ones at least, seemed to tell a story. When she had seen them all, Joan gathered them for her and had her shuffle, then cut them. Then she dealt out 3 in front of Grace. She turned over the first. "The 5 of Pentangles," she said. Grace saw what looked like a crippled boy and a barefoot woman going past a stained glass window. "You've been left out, excluded," Joan continued. "Is there someone else in your life you share this fate with?" "My brother," Grace replied, wondering and suddenly a little uncomfortable. "It looks like me and my brother." Joan replied. She turned over the next card. It was the 7 of Cups. "Choices," Joan said, "lots of choices. But see how some of the choices have consequences. Notice the death's head in the cup with the laurel. And what about the shrouded, glowing figure in the center cup at the top? What kind of choice would that be?" She turned over the last card. It was death. There was a brief, awkward silence. "Well," Grace said at last, almost laughing, "I guess we know what that means." "Do we?" Joan asked. "Look at it. There's death on a pale horse, no doubt of it. And a bishop, someone high up in the church, looks like he's almost begging death for something, maybe to leave him alone. 2 other figures on their knees, a child and a woman looking away. And see this figure on its back? He's dead, apparently, but see how he fell. Up here to the right, there's the sun. Is it rising or setting? One thing is certain, the dead man fell while he was looking at the sun. She paused, head on one side, then continued. I've been told that the death card represents change more than anything else. Looks to me like the card shows different reactions toward change. Denial, bargaining, fear, even acceptance. Whatever the change is, you have to look it in the face and then look beyond. Beyond to where the sun is. When you don't, that's when death wins. Grace was silent for a moment. Then the whirling thoughts in her head that had been swirling for over a day coalesced, and she spoke. What you say reminds me of something. I've seen what you're talking about. It happened right in front of me. Joan looked up at Grace wonderingly. Tell me, she whispered. I was 7 years old, Grace began, her voice soft, low, and sad. And I was sitting on my bed in my bedroom playing with my Barbies. I was making them kiss. She looked at Joan, who was smiling. I used to do that too, Joan said gently. It was early evening, Grace continued, and the house was starting to smell like cantaloupes. My granny was cutting up several from the garden for us to have with dinner. My room was near the kitchen. Mama was going to be home soon. We always waited dinner on her, on account of her having to drive back from Prestonville. And then I heard the back door to the house open and close, and Daddy's voice saying something to Granny. And then I looked up, and Daddy was standing in my doorway. I put the dolls down quickly because of the pained look on his face, but it wasn't that. I think maybe even then I knew that look he had wasn't a look like he was in pain because somebody else did something. It's strange. I still don't understand it, but it looked like he was hurting because he had done something really bad. It frightened me somehow. So he sat down in the foot of the bed and he said, Grace Ann, something has happened to your mama. There was an accident, Grace Ann. And I saw the tears well up in his eyes and start spilling down his cheeks. I saw that he was fighting to breathe regular somehow, fighting to keep his voice. Grace Ann, your mama's with Jesus now. Your mama's dead. She was killed by somebody driving drunk. And then he just melted. He put his hands, Grace paused, stifling a sob, to his face and just kind of bent over, and he made a sound like I've never heard. It was a moan or a cry or a wail, long and low and so full of pain, you know? I was 7 years old. I never heard anything like that. To this day, I never heard anything like it. I wanted to hug him. I wanted him to hug me. Inside, not in words, you know, but just inside, I was saying, Daddy, please don't hold yourself, hold me. I wanted him to share it with me, not keep to himself. But he moaned and he held himself and began to cry and to say over and over, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. And I just sat there and watched him, tears coming down my cheeks too, but me not crying, not really, but scared for him. And I watched him die inside. She paused, wiping away a tear. He didn't really die. He was killed in a barge accident later down in Louisiana. But that was just his body. I watched his heart die that night, the night my mama died, the night his wife died. He cried quieter and quieter all the while till he stopped, still holding himself, still holding me out with his hands over his face. And then he got up, his face all pale and kind of blank looking, and he says to me, I'm so sorry, Grace. And he left the room. There was a profound silence for a moment. I'm sorry, Grace stammered at last, suddenly rising. I didn't mean to do that. It's just that it's been on your mind, and the cards brought it out, Joan replied, putting her hand on Grace's arm. Just then the lights came up, Joan looked around to see that her other friends had returned to their table and were now rising and beckoning to her. "Look," Grace said to Joan, "normally I'd say, let's go to breakfast, but tonight, I understand," Joan replied. "Maybe some other time." "Yeah," Grace replied, thinking she was bound to run into Joan again. "See you in church," Joan called out teasingly as Grace turned to rejoin her friends.